Still. Cool. King Lindorm. There once lived a king and queen who ruled over a very great kingdom. They had large revenues and lived happily with each other. But as the years went past, the king's heart became very heavy because the queen had no children. She also sorrowed greatly over it because, although the king said nothing to her about this trouble, yet she could see that it vexed him that they had no heir to their kingdom, and she wished every day that she might have one. One day a poor old woman came to the castle and asked to speak with the queen. The royal servants answered that they could not let such a poor beggar woman into the royal mistress. They offered her a penny and told her to go away. Then the woman desired them to tell the queen that there stood at the palace gate one who could help her with her secret sorrow. This message was taken to the queen, who gave orders to bring the old woman to her. This was done, and the old woman said to her, I know your secret sorrow, O queen, and am come to help you in it. You wish to have a son, and you shall have two, if you follow my instructions. The queen was greatly surprised that the old woman knew her secret wish so well, and promised to follow her advice. You must have a bath set in your room, O queen, she said, filled with running water. When you have bathed in this, you will find under the bath 2 red onions. These you must carefully peel and eat, and in time your wish will be fulfilled. The queen did as the poor woman told her, and after she had bathed, she found 2 onions under the bath. They were both alike in size and appearance. When she saw these, she knew that the woman had been something more than she had seemed, and in her delight she ate up one of the onions, skin and all. And when she had done so, she remembered the woman had told her to peel them carefully before she ate them. And it was now too late for one of them, but she peeled the other and then ate it too. In due time it happened that as the woman had said, but the first that the queen gave birth to was a hideous Lindorm, a serpent. But no one saw this but her waiting woman, who threw it out the window into the forest beside the castle. The next that came into the world was the most beautiful little prince, and he was shown to the king and queen, who knew nothing about his brother, the Lindorm. There was now joy in the palace and over the whole country on account of the beautiful prince, but no one knew that the queen's firstborn was a Lindorm, and it lay in the forest. Time passed with the king and queen and the young prince in all happiness and prosperity, until he was 20 years of age. His parents said to him that he should journey through another kingdom and seek himself a bride, for they were beginning to grow old and would fain to see their son married before they were laid in their grave. The prince obeyed, and his horses harnessed with a gilded chariot, and set out to woo his bride. But when he came to the first crossways, there lay a huge and terrible Lindorm right across the road, so that his horses had to come to a standstill. "Where are you driving to?" said the Lindorm in a hideous voice. "That does not concern you," said the prince. "I am a prince, I can drive where I please." "Turn back," said the Lindorm. "I know your errand, but you shall get no bride until I have got a mate and slept by her side." The prince turned home again and told the king and queen what he had met at the crossroads, but they thought that he should try again on the following day and see whether he could not get past it, so that he might seek a bride in another kingdom. The prince did so, but got no further than he did the first crossroad, and there lay the Lindorm again, who stopped him the same way as before. The same thing happened on the third day, when the prince tried to get past. The Lindorm said with a threatening voice that before the prince should get a bride himself, he must find a mate. When the king and queen heard this for the third time, they could not think of any better plan than to invite the Lindorm into the palace, and they should find him a mate. They thought that Lindorm would be quite well satisfied with anyone that they might give him, and so they would have some slave women to marry the monster. The Lindorm came to the palace and received a bride in this kind, but in the morning she lay torn to pieces. So it happened every time the king and queen compelled any woman to be his bride. The report was soon spread all over the country. Now it happened that there was a man who had married a second time, and his wife heard the Lindorm with great delight. Her husband had a daughter by his first wife who was more beautiful than any of the other maidens, and so gentle and good that she won the heart of all that knew her. The second wife, however, had also a grown-up daughter who by herself would have been ugly and disagreeable enough. Besides her good and beautiful stepsister, seemed still more ugly and wicked, so that all turned from her with loathing. The stepmother had been long annoyed with her husband's daughter, was so much more beautiful than her own, and in her heart she others. When she now heard that there was in the king's palace a Lindorm which tore in pieces all women that were married to him, and demanded a beautiful maiden for his bride, she went to the king and said that her stepdaughter wished to wed the Lindorm, so that the country's only prince might travel and seek a bride. At this, the king was greatly delighted, and gave orders so that the young girl should be brought to the palace at once. When the messengers came to fetch her, she was terribly frightened, for she knew that if it was her wicked stepmother who was in this way aiming at her life, she begged that she might be allowed to spend another night in her father's house. This was granted to her, and she went to her fate in being given over to the Lindorm, and earnestly prayed her mother for counsel. How long she lay there by the grave and wept, one cannot tell, but sure it was that she fell asleep and slept until the sun rose. And she rose up from the grave, quite happy at heart, and began to search about in her fields. There she found 3 nuts, which she carefully put away in her pocket. "When I come into the very great danger, I must break one of these," she said to herself. And then she went home and set out quite willingly with the king's messengers. When these arrived at the palace with the beautiful young maiden, everyone pitied her fate, but she herself was in good courage, and asked the queen for another bridal chamber than the one the Lindorm had before. She got this, and then she requested them to put a full pot of strong lye in the fire, and lay down 3 new scrubbing brushes. The queen gave orders that everything should be done as she desired, and then the maiden dressed herself in 7 clean snow-white shirts, and held her wedding with Lindorm. When they were left alone in the bridal chamber, the Lindorm, in a threatening voice, ordered her to undress herself. "Undress yourself first," she said. "None of the others bade me to do that," he said in surprise. "But I bid you," she said. Then the Lindorm began to writhe and groan and breathe heavily, and after a little while he had cast his outer skin, which lay on the floor, hideous to behold. Then his bride took off one of her snow-white shirts and cast it on the Lindorm's skin. He again ordered her to undress, and again she commanded him to do so first. He had to obey, and with groaning in pain, cast off another skin after another. For each skin the maiden threw off one of her shirts, until there lay on the floor 7 Lindorm skins and 6 snow-white shirts. The 7th she still had on. The Lindorm now lay before her as a formless, slimy mass, which she, with all her might, began to scrub with a lye and the new scrubbing brushes. When she had nearly worn out the last of these, she stood there before her, the loveliest youth in the land. She thanked her for saving him from his enchantment, and told her that he was the king and the queen's eldest son, and the true heir to the kingdom. Then he asked her whether she would keep the promise she had made to the Lindorm and share everything with him. To this she was well content to answer, "Yes." Each time that the Lindorm had held his wedding, one of the king's retainers was sent the next morning to open the door of the bridal chamber and see whether the bride was alive. The next morning he also peeped at the door, but what he saw there surprised him so much that he shut the door in a hurry and hastened to the king and queen, who were waiting eagerly for his report. He told them the wonderful sight he had seen. On the floor lay 7 Lindorm skins and 6 snow-white shirts. Beside these were 3 worn-out scrubber brushes, while in the bed a beautiful youth was laying asleep beside the fair young maiden. The king and queen marveled greatly at what this could mean, but just then the old woman who had spoken in the beginning of the story was also brought into the queen. She reminded her how she had not followed her instructions and had eaten the first onion with all its skins, on which account her firstborn had been born a Lindorm. The waiting maid was then summoned and admitted that she had thrown out the window into the forest. The king and queen now sent for their eldest son and his new young bride. They took them both in their arms and asked him to tell about his sorrowful lot during 20 years he had lived in the forest as a hideous Lindorm. This he did, and then his parents had it proclaimed over the whole country that he was their eldest son, and along with his spouse should inherit the kingdom and the country after them. Prince Lindorm and his beautiful wife now lived in joy and prosperity for a time in the palace, and when his father was laid in his grave, not long after this, he obtained the whole kingdom. Soon afterwards, his mother also departed from the world. Now it happened that an enemy declared war against the young king, and he foresaw that it would be 3 years at the least before he could return to his country and his queen. He ordered all his servants who remained at home to guard her most carefully. That they might be able to write to each other in confidence, he had 2 seal rings made, one for himself and one for his queen, and issued an order that no one, under pain of death, was to open any letter that was sealed with one of these. Then he took farewell of his queen and marched out to war. The queen's wicked stepmother had heard with great grief that her beautiful stepdaughter had prospered so well that she had not only preserved her life, but had even become the queen of her country. Now she plotted continually how she might destroy her good fortune. While King Lindorm was away at the war, the wicked woman came to the queen and spoke fair to her, saying that she had always foreseen that her stepdaughter was destined to become something great in the world, and that she had on this account secured that she should be the enchanted prince's bride. The queen, who did not imagine that any person could be so deceitful, bade her stepmother welcome, and kept her close beside her. Soon after this, the queen had 2 children, the prettiest boys that anyone had seen, and when she had written a letter to the king to tell him of this, her stepmother asked leave to comb her hair for her, and her own mother used to do. The queen gave her permission, and the stepmother combed her hair until she fell asleep. Then she took the seal ring off her neck and exchanged the letter for another, in which she had written to the queen had given birth to 2 whelps. When the king received this letter, he was greatly distressed, but he remembered how he himself had lived for 20 years as a Lindorm, and had been freed from the spell by his young queen. He therefore wrote back to his most trusted retainer that the queen and her 2 whelps should be taken care of while he was away. Stepmother, however, took this letter as well, and wrote a new one in which the king ordered that the queen and the 2 little princes should be burnt at the stake. This she also sealed with the queen's seal, which was, in all respect, like the king's. The retainer was greatly shocked and grieved at the king's orders, for which he could discover no reason, but he had not the heart to destroy the 3 innocent beings. He had kindled a great fire, and in this he burned a sheep and 2 lambs, as to make people believe he had carried out the king's commands. The stepmother had these known to people, adding that the queen was actually a wicked sorceress. The faithful servant, however, told the queen that it was the king's command that during the years he was absent in the war, she should keep herself concealed in the castle, so that no one but himself could see her and the little princes. The queen obeyed, and no one knew that both she and her children had not been burned. But when the time came near the King Lindorm to return home from the war, the old retainer grew frightened because he had not obeyed his orders. He therefore went to the queen and told her everything, at the same time showing her the king's letter containing the command to burn her and the princes. Then he begged her to leave the palace before the king returned. The queen now took her 2 little sons and wandered out into the wild forest. They walked all day without finding a human habitation, and became very tired. The queen then caught sight of a man who carried some venison. He seemed very poor and wretched, but the queen was glad to see a human being, and asked him whether he knew where she and her little children could get a house over their heads for the night. The man answered that he had a little hut in the forest, and that she could rest there, but he also said that he was one who lived entirely apart from men, and owned no more than the hut, a horse, and a dog, and supported himself by hunting. The queen followed him to the hut, and rested there overnight with her children. When she awoke in the morning, the man had already gone out hunting. The queen then began to put the room in order and prepare food, so that when the man came home he found everything neat and tidy, and this seemed to give him some pleasure. He spoke but little, however. All the same he said about himself was that his name was Peter. Later in the day he rode out into the forest, and the queen thought that he looked very unhappy. While he was away she looked about her in the hut a little bit more closely, and found a tub full of shirts stained with blood lying among water. She was surprised at this, but thought that the man would get his blood on the shirt when he was carrying home venison. She washed the shirts and hung them to dry, and said nothing to Peter about the matter. After some time had passed, she noticed that every day he came riding home from the forest, he took off a blood-stained shirt and put on a clean one. She then saw that it was something else other than blood of the deer that stained the shirts, so one day she took courage and asked him about it. At first he refused to tell her, but then she related to him her own story and how she had succeeded in delivering Lindorm. Then he told her that he had formerly lived a wild life, and had finally entered into a written contract with an evil spirit. Before this contract had expired, he had repented and turned from his old ways and withdrawn himself to solitude. The evil one had then lost all power to take him, but so long as he had the contact, he could compel him to meet him in the forest every day at a certain time, where the evil spirits then scourged him till he bled. The next day, when the time came for the man to ride into the forest, the queen asked him to stay at home and look after the princes, and she would go meet the evil spirits in his place. The man was amazed and said that this would not only cost her life, but would also bring upon him the greater misfortune than the one that was already so unclear and he was under. She bade him to be of good courage, and looked to see that she had the 3 nuts which she had found beside their mother's grave, mounted the horse, and rode out into the forest. When she had ridden for some time, the evil spirits came forth and said, "Here comes Peter's horse and Peter's hound, but Peter himself is not with them." Then at a distance she heard the terrible voice demanding to know what she wanted. "I've come to get Peter's contract." At this there arose a terrible uproar among the evil spirits, and the worst voice among them all had said, "Ride home and tell Peter that when he comes tomorrow he shall get twice as many strokes as usual." The queen then took one of her nuts and cracked it, and turned her horse about it. At this sparks from fire flew out of all the trees, and the evil spirits howled as if they were being scourged back to their abode. The next day at the same time the queen rode out again to the forest, but on this occasion the spirits did not dare to come so near her. They would not, however, give up the contract, but threatened both her and the man. Then she cracked her second nut, and all the forest behind her seemed to be on fire and flames, and the evil spirits howled even worse than on the previous day, but the contract they would not give up. The queen only had 1 nut left now, but even that she was ready to give up in order to deliver the man. This time she cracked the nut as soon as she came near the place where the spirit appeared, and when that happened to them she could not see them, but amid wild screams and howls the contract was handed to her at the end of a long branch. The queen rode happily home to the hut, and happier still was the man who had been sitting in great anxiety, for now he was freed from all the power of the evil spirits. Meanwhile, King Lindorm had come home from the war, and the first question he asked when he entered the palace was about his queen and the whelps. The attendants were surprised, for they knew of no whelps. The queen had had 2 beautiful princes, but the king had sent orders that all these were to be burned. The king grew pale with sorrow and anger, and ordered them to summon his trusted retainer, to whom he had sent the instructions that the queen and the whelps were to be carefully looked after. The retainer, however, showed him the letter in which there was written in the queen that her children were to be burned, and everyone then understood that some great treachery had been enacted. When the king's trusted retainer saw his master's deep sorrow, he confessed to him that he had spared the lives of the queen and the princes, and had only burned a sheep and 2 lambs, and had kept the queen and her children hidden in the palace for 3 years, and had sent her out into the wild forests just when the king was expected home. When the king heard this, his sorrow was lessened, and he said that he would wander out into the forest and return and search for his wife and children. If he found them, he would return to his palace, but if he did not find them, he would never see it again, and in that case the faithful retainer who had saved the lives of the queen and princes should be the king. The king then went forth into the wild forest, and wandered there a whole day without seeing a single human being. And so it went with him the 2nd day, but on the 3rd day he came by roundabout ways to the little hut. He went in there, and asked for leave to rest himself a little on the bench. The queen and the princes were there, but she was poorly clad, and so sorrowful that the king did not recognize her. Neither did he think for a moment that the 2 children, who were dressed only in rough skins, were his own sons. He lay down on the bench, and, tired as he was, soon fell asleep. The bench was a narrow one, and he kept his arm, and fell down and hung by the side of it. "My son, go and lift your father's arm back up on the bench," she said, queen to one of the princes, for she easily knew the king again, although she was afraid to make herself known to him. The boy went up and took the king's arm, but being only a child, he did not lift it up very gently onto the bench. The king woke to this, thinking at first that he had fallen into a den of robbers, but he decided to keep quiet and pretend that he was asleep until he could find out what kind of folk were actually in the house. He lay still for a while, and no one moved in the room. He again let his arm glide down off the bench. Then he heard a woman's voice say, "My son, go and lift your father's arm on the bench, and don't do it so roughly as your brother did." And then he felt a little pair of hands clasping softly on his arm, opened his eyes, and saw his queen and her children. He sprang up and caught all three in his arms, and afterwards took them, along with the man and his horse and his hound, back to the palace with great joy. The most unbounded rejoicing reigned therein, as well as over the whole kingdom. But the wicked stepmother was burned. King Lindorm lived long and happily with his queen, and there are some who say that if they're not dead now, they are still living to this day.